Lucy Letby was wrong. It wasn't a gang of 4, it was 7.
This is a very basic thing. We teach all our medical students not to do this. All right? This is what was done here.
So for many people who have now seen the ITV documentary on the Lucy Letby case, the alleged positive tests for insulin poisoning have been discredited. There are more grounds for reasonable doubt, I believe, than were covered in the documentary due to time constraints. Now that the finger is being pointed away from Lucy Letby, I think there are now realistic and credible grounds to point the finger of blame towards Dr. John Gibbs for poor management of baby F's hypoglycemia. This poor management likely includes repeated lump doses of sugar instead of a steady infusion, failure to recognise on examining the baby that an intravenous line was in fact delivering fluid and glucose to surrounding tissues rather than delivering into the vein. Furthermore, when the junior doctor queried sepsis with Dr. Gibbs, he negotiated treatment that was probably a lucky guess over the phone, rather than bothering to come into the hospital and examine the baby himself. Further to that, the prosecution alleged that the blood sugar sunk to a level that was so low it was life-threatening. On hearing this, Dr. Gibbs, as the on-call consultant, would again elect to stay in bed for another 5 hours rather than examine the baby. So you might wonder, if the medical negligence from Dr. Gibbs was so bad, why did the police and prosecution bring the case to trial? You could think that exposing the fact that one of the consultants in a unit where a serial killer is supposed to be operating is a consultant with a huge capacity for negligence could create a conflicting message. I think it comes down to the fact that the police were building a case against Lucy Letby and had already sunk large amounts of public money into the investigation once they discovered a blood result with a specific pattern of high insulin and low C-peptide. Legally, the phenomenon of high insulin and low C-peptide has been used to secure the convictions of several other alleged serial killer nurses such as Beverly Allett and Colin Norris. Therefore, the discovery of this blood result is a very persuasive piece of evidence for the police and Crown Prosecution Service. However, new research casts doubt on the reliability of insulin immunoassay tests. More specifically, as was mentioned on the recent ITV documentary, premature and newborn babies are likely particularly prone to false positives. So there are 2 on-call consultants who were on shift during the night shift from the 4th to the 5th, and then subsequently the day shift of the 5th. These are firstly Dr. Gibbs, who phones it in to an extent, despite evidence of a potentially serious situation, and then Dr. Saladi, who resolves some of the issues, although I think Dr. Lee would say not with perfect foresight. A contentious part of the baby F case is that there is some dispute over whether or not the baby was infected. Dr. Gibbs says that he thought the baby was infected, but tries to shift the blame for the symptoms to an alleged insulin poisoning. Dr. Saladi's testimony gives indications that the baby did have an infection. Looking at Dr. Saladi's cross-examination from day 39, defense lawyer Ben Myers puts it to him, "Can you confirm in fact baby F did have an infection as it happens? Do you recall that?" Dr. Saladi responds, "The CRP did go up, and then we did grow a bug from the logline tip as well." So, to make sense of this point, quote, "We did grow a bug from the longline tip," close quote, for those who may be unaware. The long line goes directly into the baby's vein and can be used to deliver medications, fluid, and nutrition. As the long line is in contact with the baby's bloodstream, it may pick up some bacteria if there are bacteria circulating in the baby's blood. Normally there should be none, but in this case it is suspected. Because the number of bacteria present on the long line tip may be very low, it becomes very hard to measure. However, if the long line tip is taken to the laboratory, it can then be put in an environment that is conducive for the growth of the bacteria. After a certain period of time, the presence of bacteria on the long line tip will have grown sufficiently that the bacteria will be much easier to measure and detect. A blood sample was also taken from baby F, and there was an attempt to grow a detectable bacteria from that blood sample, but the baby had been treated with several antibiotics which complicated the process of growing bacteria on a sample in the lab. There are other indicators that baby F had an infection. Looking at the transcript from day 39, defense lawyer Ben Myers reads from the medical notes, quote, CRP increased from 1 to 40. Dr. Saladi responds, yes, and up to 10 is a normal range. 40 would be consistent with an infection developing, Ben Myers says. Dr. Saladi responds, that is correct, yes. I think most doctors would say the rise in CRP is an indicator of infection in this case, as it would be unprecedented for this rise in CRP to occur in response to insulin poisoning. So aside from the issue of infection, the other issue baby F has is also low blood sugar, which is probably a consequence of the infection. Looking at Dr. Peter Hindmarsh's direct examination from day 38 of the trial, the prosecutor puts it to Dr. Peter Hindmarsh, quote, we see there, Professor, at 01:54 hours a blood sugar reading for baby F of 0.8. Peter Hindmarsh responds, that's correct. The prosecutor says, what does that reading mean? Dr. Hindmarsh responds, well, it represents a very significant change from the value recorded on 4th of August at 23:32 hours, which was 5.5, and a value of 0.8 millimoles per litre is extremely low. The prosecutor then says, we'll deal later with the potential consequences of such low blood sugar, but in general terms at this stage, is that low reading a cause for concern? Dr. Hindmarsh responds, absolutely. If you look at the mother of child F's victim impact statement, she says she believes this period of low blood sugar had profound consequences. Quote, child F has been diagnosed with severe learning difficulties, which we believe is a result of being poisoned with a large quantity of insulin. We attend regular hospital visits for child F, complex and severe disabilities. So considering everything that you have heard that is going on with child F, Dr. Gibbs gets a call from the junior doctor at 3:30 in the morning of August 5th. At that point, the low blood sugar value of 0.8 has already been recorded. It is suspected that the baby has sepsis, but is not yet confirmed. In what I think is an outrageous move, despite Dr. Gibbs being the on-call consultant, he gives the junior doctor some over-the-phone instructions and declines to come into the hospital to actually take charge like he should and examine the baby himself. I struggle to see how the prosecution can have it both ways. If the low blood sugar value of 0.8 is so serious that it supports an allegation of attempted murder, then how do they also justify Dr. Gibbs staying in bed and not examining the baby until the morning? There is a source on the kind of salary Dr. Gibbs would be paid as an on-call paediatric consultant. That source is fellow Lucy Letby accuser Dr. Ravi Jayaram.
I'm going to offer myself for a shift I regularly do, a weekend on call as a paediatric consultant.
It's not an exact comparison, as Dr. Jayaram is talking about a weekend, whereas Dr. Gibbs was doing what seems to be a night shift on call. We know from the trial that 2 nights earlier, when baby E deteriorated, Dr. ZA responded to the call. These are the figures Dr. Jayaram quotes.
All 4 NHS-approved agencies that I called quoted me a staggering £5,000 for the same shift.
This is from the transcript of day 37 when Dr. Gibbs is asked about taking charge of the situation. Defense lawyer Ben Myers puts it to him, quote, we'll hear from Dr. Hartness, the junior doctor, in due course, but would the need for this review have been overseen by you as the consultant of the week? Dr. Gibbs responds, I was ultimately responsible, but at the time, at 1:30 in the morning, Dr. Harkness was on night shift and I was on call at home. Defense lawyer Ben Myers says, was this brought to your attention? Dr. Gibbs responds, later on at about 3:30 in the morning, Dr. Harkness phoned me. Some of the details that Dr. Gibbs relayed to the junior doctor, Dr. Harkness, are discussed on day 37 in the transcript. For instance, the instruction, quote, suggest repeating fluid bolus, close quote. The problem here is, as you'll hear from Dr. Lee, This is not an effective treatment and it goes against standard treatment guidelines.
When you give repeated bolus doses, it means that you just pump a big dose in at one time, of 10% dextrose, it actually worsens the hypoglycemia.
I think this concept overlaps with some dietary advice that people sometimes hear, though there are differences. In this case, sugar is being administered straight into the vein, so bypasses the digestive system.
Because every time you pump a surge of glucose in, the glucose rises in the blood. There's a surge of glucose. And that triggers a surge of insulin production.
You might be able to guess what happens next.
And that surge of insulin will then force down the glucose. And then you get hypoglycemic again.
Although bolus doses may be used to kickstart the recovery from hypoglycemia, Dr. Lee recommends a steadily increased dose.
You give a continuous infusion and then you titrate it to increase the amount required so that the glucose will then come up in the blood and come.
In this case, they have a steady dose going on in the background. However, for most of the time, they don't increase this dose. Instead, for some reason, they keep going back to the kickstart phase with boluses. One of the issues is that the line tissues. This means that the intravenous line either falls short of the vein or pokes through. This means that fluid and nutrients are delivered to surrounding tissues rather than delivered into the vein. So for some period, the line wasn't delivering any glucose. Dr. Lee says he thinks this happened far earlier than discovered.
And it was also noted there was extensive swelling and induration, meaning very hard, of the right groin, thigh, and leg. What that means is that this infiltration had gone on for quite a long time.
So at 10 a.m., it was discovered that the line had been tissued for an extensive period of time. This means that when Dr. Gibbs finally came to the hospital at 8:30, the line was likely already tissued at that point. Yet he failed to notice this on his examination of the baby. Dr. Gibbs says of his examination on arrival at the hospital, quote, "Because his blood sugar had fallen again to 1.7 when I saw him at 8:30 in the morning, the plan was to give a further glucose bolus to get the blood sugar up." Dr. Gibbs then says, quote, "Then it's query, meaning it wasn't up to me to make the final decision because I had been on call overnight, but my consultant colleague, Dr. Letby, was now consultant of the week and in fact about to do a ward round of the neonatal unit on a Wednesday morning," close quote. He says he's been on call all night, like he's been busting a gut. From the transcript, it reads like he hasn't done much more than make a couple of phone calls through the night. So, to look at the pattern of hypoglycemia, there's a value of 0.8 recorded at 1:54 a.m. At this point in time, Lucy Letby is working a night shift and Dr. Gibbs is at home, probably in bed. Dr. Harkness, the junior doctor, treats with a mixture of boluses and an infusion. At 2:55 a.m., the glucose value of 2.3 is recorded, which is an improvement but still in the hypoglycemic range. An infusion is ongoing, but it's only 10% dextrose. At 4:02 a.m., the blood glucose falls back down to 1.9, perhaps because boluses have stopped and they haven't increased the infusion. I'm not sure. At 5 a.m., the blood glucose has increased to 2.9, which is in the normal range. This comes after several boluses between 4 and 5 a.m. At 8:09 a.m., the blood glucose falls back down to 1.7. I think the most likely explanation for this is that at some point between 5 and 8 a.m., the line became tissued, so the baby stopped receiving glucose. At 10 a.m., it's discovered that the line has tissued, and it's also noted the blood glucose has fallen to 1.3. The infusion is turned off, and there's a delay whilst a new long line is put in. At 11:46, the blood glucose is 1.4. Then there's a significant increase 14 minutes later once the infusion is restarted. During the afternoon shift, the hypoglycemia persists until 7 p.m. when the 10% infusion is changed to 15%. Lucy Letby is not on shift for the afternoon shift and Dr. Letby is in charge. Every blood glucose value that is recorded between 12 and 7 p.m. is in the hypoglycemic range. If you go by prosecution witness Dr. Peter Hindmarsh, the duration of hypoglycemia is as much of a factor as a particularly low value. So all in all, I think the evidence supports that baby F's hypoglycemia is explainable by suboptimal management of hypoglycemia, which occurred as a consequence of sepsis. And I think many people would agree with Dr. Lee that you don't need insulin poisoning to explain the pattern of hypoglycemia. So the other issue with the baby F case is the blood test, which was taken at 5:56 p.m. on the day of August 5th, about 10 hours after Lucy Letby had left the hospital. This blood test showed high insulin and low C-peptide, which suggested insulin poisoning. So there's the issue of antibody interference with the tests, but probably the bigger issue in the baby F case is that insulin stays in the blood for a very short period of time, and Lucy Letby hasn't been at the hospital for 10 hours when the blood sample is taken. Because of this, the prosecution have come up with the theory that Lucy Letby must have spiked feed bags. If you look at this article in Telegraph, they quote from a chemical engineer, Helen Shannon, and a bioengineer, Jeff Chase, who say, quote, "There was no possibility to commit insulin poisoning as hypothesized in court. If no insulin is missing, there is no way to commit that crime. Insulin sticking to lines, bags, tubes is a known thing, and it can significantly impact, for example, insulin pump use among small children. The lack of missing insulin is the true smoking gun in this case." It was noted in court that there was minimal unaccounted for insulin. The other issue with the poisoning off shift is another nurse called Shelley Tomlins hung up baby F's feed bag whilst Lucy Letby wasn't there. If you look at this segment from the transcript of the judge's summing up, she, as in the nurse Shelley Tomlins, hung a new bag at 12. She said the new bag, which replaced the bespoke bag that had been made for baby F, would have been taken from the stock of bags in the fridge on the unit. She thought there would be about 5 bags stored in the fridge at any one time. So if Lucy Letby did spike a bag, it would have been incredible luck that the nurse picked up the bag that she had spiked and gave that one out of the 5 to the baby. An explanation for why the test result of high insulin and low C-peptide was observed is that it occurred because antibodies interfered with the test result. There are 2 known methods by which antibody binding may produce a false positive with an insulin immunoassay. The more recently observed method is that human anti-mouse antibodies bind to monoclonal antibodies in the immunoassay test. So you could almost think of this as the human immune system attacking the test. The method that's been known about for a longer period of time is that insulin autoantibodies produced from within the human body bind to insulin and make insulin circulate within the blood for significantly longer than is normal. If you go by Jeff Chase and Helen Shannon, the type of antibody interference most likely to have occurred in the Lucy Letby case with premature babies leading to a false positive is the insulin autoantibodies bound to insulin and prolonged insulin circulation in the blood. This is because there is evidence that premature babies have far higher levels of insulin autoantibodies than adults. I recently became aware of this study, which I will link in the description if you want to examine it, as it will give you an indication of how disproportionately common insulin autoantibodies are in premature babies, titled Insulin Autoantibodies in Cord Blood from Neonates with and Without a Sibling with Type 1 Diabetes, Prevalence and Characterization. Reading through this quote from the results, specific insulin to antibody binding activity was noted at birth in 8 out of 12 neonates with a diabetic sibling and in 79 out of 112 control newborns. So that's 70% of premature babies in this study having the antibodies that can cause a false positive, compared to likely less than 1% of adults. So in conclusion, the evidence that Lucy Letby would have intentionally poisoned baby F is extremely weak. There are major questions about Dr. Gibbs' reaction to what was described as a near-fatal episode of low blood sugar. There are also questions about his reaction to suspected sepsis. In this case, it appears antibiotics cleared the infection, but he was gambling that the baby didn't have viral sepsis, antibiotic-resistant septicemia, or something more complicated that should have required consultant presence.